The conquest that changed everything. How America was colonized. 1492 to 1600. Picture this. It's October 12th, 1492. A Genoese navigator, lost and desperate after weeks at sea, spots land on the horizon. Christopher Columbus has no idea he's about to trigger the most catastrophic collision of civilizations in human history. In that single moment, two worlds that had existed in complete isolation for over 15,000 years were about to meet. And one would never recover. What happened next wasn't just exploration. It was the systematic dismantling of entire civilizations, the birth of a global economy built on exploitation, and the beginning of European dominance that would reshape every continent on Earth. This is the untold story of how a handful of European adventurers, armed with superior technology, deadly diseases, and ruthless ambition, conquered a hemisphere. The fatal first contact. Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean wasn't the neat, civilized encounter your textbooks described. Within hours of landing, he was already calculating the profit potential of the Taino people he encountered, writing in his journal that they would make fine slaves. The die was cast. This wouldn't be a meeting of equals, but a predator-prey relationship that would define the next century. The Spanish moved with terrifying efficiency. By 1519, Hernán Cortés had landed in Mexico with just 600 men, yet within 2 years, the mighty Aztec Empire, which had dominated Mesoamerica for centuries, lay in ruins. How did such a small force topple a civilization of millions? The answer reveals the deadly trinity that made European colonization possible. Superior weaponry, indigenous allies seeking revenge against their oppressors, and most devastatingly, diseases that killed 90% of the native population before most had even seen a European face. Smallpox, measles, and typhus raced ahead of the conquistadors like invisible cavalry, leaving behind empty cities and broken societies. Tenochtitlan, once among the world's largest cities, became a graveyard. The psychological impact was as destructive as the physical. How do you resist invaders when your gods seem to have abandoned you to plague? The machinery of exploitation. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. The Spanish didn't just want to conquer, they wanted to extract every ounce of wealth from their new territories. Enter the encomienda system, a legal framework that was slavery by another name. Spanish colonists were granted entire indigenous communities as wards, with the right to their labor and tribute. The fiction was that they were converting natives to Christianity. The reality was systematic exploitation that would make modern human traffickers blush. By 1545, Spanish miners had discovered the Silver Mountain of Potosi in present-day Bolivia. This single mine would produce more silver than had existed in all of Europe, flooding global markets and financing Spanish ambitions worldwide. But the cost was staggering. Historians estimate that 8 million indigenous people died in Potosi's mines over 3 centuries. The phrase "worth a Potosi" entered Spanish vocabulary, but nobody mentioned the rivers of blood that flowed beneath the silver. Meanwhile, other European powers watched Spain's newfound wealth with growing envy and alarm. France began establishing trading posts along the North American coast, focusing on the fur trade and maintaining relatively peaceful relationships with indigenous nations like the Huron and Algonquin. The French approach was different. They needed native allies to navigate the vast wilderness and didn't have the manpower for large-scale conquest. The English Gambit. Then came the English, and with them, a colonization model that would prove even more devastating in the long run. Unlike the Spanish conquistadors seeking quick wealth or French traders building commercial relationships, the English came to stay. They brought families, plows, and an unshakable belief that the land was theirs by divine right. The Virginia Company's establishment of Jamestown in 1607 marked a new phase of colonization. These weren't just raiders or traders. They were colonists intent on permanent settlement. The implications were existential for indigenous peoples. Spanish colonization often left native societies intact, but subordinated. English colonization erased them entirely. The English settlers faced their own brutal realities. The starving time of 1609 to 1610 saw Jamestown's population drop from 500 to 60, with survivors resorting to cannibalism. But they persisted, and their persistence would prove more destructive than any conquistador's sword. They brought a different kind of colonization, one that didn't just exploit native peoples, but replaced them entirely. By the 1580s, English privateers like Francis Drake were already raiding Spanish settlements and treasure fleets, part of a broader imperial competition that would define the next 3 centuries. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe, 1577 to 1580, wasn't just an adventure. It was reconnaissance for future conquest, mapping Spanish weaknesses and identifying opportunities for English expansion. The Reckoning. Here's the staggering reality that should make your blood run cold. By 1600, just over a century after Columbus's landing, the indigenous population of the Americas had dropped from an estimated 50 to 100 million to fewer than 10 million. This wasn't gradual decline. It was demographic catastrophe on a scale that dwarfs any genocide in recorded history. But the colonizers weren't finished. The wealth flowing from the Americas funded European wars, built global trading empires, and financed the scientific revolution. The profits from American silver and indigenous labor helped lift Europe out of medieval poverty and into global dominance. The colonization of America wasn't just about America. It was the foundation of the modern global economy. The patterns established between 1492 and 1600 would echo through centuries. The doctrine of discovery that justified seizing empty lands, the racial hierarchies that classified indigenous peoples as subhuman, the extraction economies that viewed entire continents as resource mines. These weren't accidents. They were the deliberate architecture of empire. As we stand today, surrounded by the fruits of that conquest, from the cities built on indigenous graveyards to the wealth that still flows from resources first stolen 5 centuries ago, we're living in the world that Columbus's voyage created. The colonization of America wasn't a historical footnote. It was the hinge of human history, the moment when one small corner of the world began its domination of all the rest. The question that should haunt us: if a few hundred desperate Europeans could reshape an entire hemisphere in just over a century, what does that tell us about the fragility of civilizations, the power of technology, and the catastrophic potential of first contact between unequal societies? The answer might be more relevant to our future than we'd like to admit.